How well did I stick to the manual in my delivery? I queued up the device correctly by introducing what the acronym standed for and pointed out where it was in the classroom, which was on a whiteboard. Now, if this was my classroom, I would have had a poster displayed. And in future uses, when I do teach CERs, I will have those displayed. I told the students that they would be creating the graphic device with me. So I did the cueing correctly. We talked about what it meant, and then we talked about their involvement in the graphic device. Now, the do part of the cue, do, review step. So I went over the critical question of how do you use FOIL to solve for binomial? And we went over why this question was critical, because I had a student stating that it was not a critical question, and it's not critical. So we went over that a little bit more in depth, and I described how important it was. The second box is where I feel like I didn't implement it quite correctly. My students came up with FOIL and defined FOIL correctly. And they also came up with binomial, which were the two words that I wanted. And when my students defined binomial, the definition that he provided was close, but not the exact definition that is in their notes. So I provided that as well. I should have allowed for more time for them to come up with different key terms. For example, like term. This came up later in our supporting questions because you have to be able to combine like terms and know what like terms are to be able to use FOIL. Moving on to the supporting questions in the third box on the question exploration guide. I had the students break out into smaller groups. Some students actually just wanted to work individually, so I allowed that. But here's where the implementation fidelity happened was I didn't really describe what I wanted from the students. I should have said, what supporting questions do we need to know? What do we need to know to answer the critical questions? What do we need to know about FOIL or binomials or like terms? I should have done that, but I didn't. So that is something that I would change in the future. So I gave the students a couple minutes. I originally planned for 10 minutes, but the students were not coming up with the supporting questions. Some of them got it, some of them were quite stumped. So we came back as a class. Now, when we were coming up with these questions as a class, I felt that I was providing a little bit too much guidance. They were coming up with, okay, what is the first step? What does F stand for? They were coming up with those questions, and we were getting the right definitions or answers for those questions. But then again, I felt like I provided a little bit too much guidance and didn't let the class come up with the questions as much as I should have. In the future, I will provide my class with more time to come up with the questions and less guidance, so they are actually creating the graphic device. Now for our fourth step, it went awesome. My students got to the main idea, which is what you want in a CER. So their definition, which is better than mine, so solve all those 5 steps to solve for binomials. So they got that they needed to do those 5 steps of multiplying the first, then the out, and then the in, and then the last, and then we had to combine the like terms. So that was pretty nice. The 5th step, they had to solve an equation by themselves by utilizing these steps. And most of my class solved for the equation correctly. So they got the steps of formula. Now, the 6th step went okay. Some of my students understood how to utilize this in the real world. One of my students said construction, which I thought was pretty good. Another one said baking soda, but I think she just meant baking and finding the areas of different things along the lines of that. I brought up the example of gardening, and so they wrote their real world example on their sheet. Now, the review, I feel that I could have done better. I did not go over the critical question, which is what the manual says to do in the review. And so that was wrong of me. We talked about how we could use this in other classes, like in a science class or an English class or other math classes. So that was important. However, we should have reviewed the steps of FOIL and make it kind of a whole. Any adjustments I made during my lesson to meet the students' needs. One adjustment that I made was I provided more direction in the lesson when needed. So I provided more direction and more cues to the supporting questions. And I said earlier in the video, I feel like I did a little bit more than I should have to kind of guide the students on where I wanted them to go with what the supporting questions were. So I provided that adjustment to it. And then I also provided a little bit more guidance when we were going over the how can we use the main idea, which is the assessment on if they can solve for FOIL. I provided more support to a student that's new to our school, and at his old school, he was in a gen ed math class, but coming to St. Francis, we didn't have his math class and the right math class for him this trimester. So he was put into this academic strategies as kind of a segue into next year. So he didn't learn FOIL from the gen ed teacher like the rest of the class did. So I provided a little bit more guidance to him, which you can see at the end of the video that I'm helping him out a little bit more. He's the one that's right there. And so I provided that guidance because he didn't know what to do. Then I provided a little bit more guidance to the student that was gone the day before when they were actually learning FOIL. But she caught on really quick, and there wasn't a lot of guidance that needed to be done for that. I also provided adjustments on who I called on. So there were two main kids that were answering my questions in this class. So I kind of called on the students that I saw that weren't really engaged. There is a moment in the video where I say, I believe your name is Nick, because Nick has his head down, kind of in his hands, not really paying attention, not looking like he's paying attention. So to get him engaged, I called on him and I asked him if he could help us answer this question. And he answered correctly. He was getting the concepts. And I knew this from talking to my mentor teacher who teaches this class, kind of how to get him engaged and how to start it, because I knew he was more of a difficult student. And I also called on a student that I knew she was getting it, but wasn't answering any of the questions, because she's a quieter student. So I eventually called on her, and that's because I heard her talking. I heard somebody talking in the front of the class, and I'm pretty sure it was the girl that I called on. So I said, I hear somebody's answer. Who has the answer up here? And then I called on Allison because I knew she was getting the concept that I wanted her to participate with the answer. And she gave us her answer. And then I also, because this class is at the end of the day, so kids get a little antsy. So I had to do some redirection verbally on saying, bringing it forward at the very end because they got a little bit too chatty. And they jumped back right away and then got right back into the swing of things. So those were the major adjustments I did to kind of fit the needs of the class. One thing that I would do differently if I were going to give this lesson to the same learner is that I would have provided more direction for the supporting questions box in the graphic device. I feel that I didn't provide the right kind of directions, and I didn't really think through that. I simply told the students that we are going to unpack the questions. So think of questions and answers and write them on the back of your worksheet of what questions do we need to know to answer the critical question. Where, if I was teaching this lesson again, I would say, all right, let's think of before we break off into groups, let's think of a supporting question. Our first supporting question as a group. All right, so let's look at our critical question. What do we need to know? All right, we need to know how to solve for FOIL, right? What's the first step of FOIL? And then they would say, well, you have to multiply the first two variables. And I would say fabulous, and we would do that as a class. And then I would break them off into smaller groups. Or individually, if that's what the student wants. Because there were some students in this class that just didn't want to work with their peers, which is fine. So, and then with that direction, they would be able to come up with those supporting questions and answers. And then when we came back as a group, I wouldn't have had to provide so much guidance on it. That's what I would change in this lesson.